just before, can I quickly assure that the rest of the panel is here? You could either unmute yourself or write it in the chat. Abid, are you here?
Yes.
Great. Siam?
Yep, here.
Shadman's here. Tamim?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. Nazifa?
Here.
Ongita, I think you're here, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. We're just waiting on the teams and then we can start.
I can see most of both the teams here. I think it would be a roll call.
Okay, can I confirm if Gav is here?
Yeah, BDC1 is here.
JDC1's here. In opposition, JDC1, are you here? Are all members present?
Yes, you're here.
Okay, perfect. Without further ado, welcome to the finals of Pre-Worlds, guys. Congratulations for making it so far. Really proud of all of you. For the finals, the motion reads, "This House believes that the Jacobin Reign of Terror did more to protect liberty than to destroy it." It would be lovely if any one person from the panel can give timestamps. I will keep it on my end, but I'm averse to giving timestamps because it interferes with my note-taking. Have your POI preferences set before your speeches, and best of luck. Without further ado, PM whenever you're ready.
Lamia,
I'm keeping a
share-
visible timer so that
I will share
you
one
can see the one.
in the chat, Sharman. No worries.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Just before PM starts, can I get confirmation that BDC the BDC Zoom account is streaming this? Because I thought it was supposed to be streamed. Okay, no, I meant like with it.
From proposition, NIFA does not want to be recorded. Like our LO, our PM does not want to be recorded. The rest of us are okay with it.
I'll stop now. Start recording from LO. Okay.
PM whenever you're ready.
Hi, I will just take 5 seconds if that's okay. I did not hear it before. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. As the reign of terror was the only way to save post-revolution France, couldn't be
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, calling upon Elo. But right before, we're just gonna have like 30 seconds before Ankita can make it back to the call.
Yeah, I'm back whenever the Elo is ready.
Perfect. Elo, whenever you're ready.
Am I clearly audible?
Yes.
Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, think about a world where you have political freedom, you have freedom of speech, you have your own dignity, that is, you receive the rights you are supposed to receive as a human, like equal rights to, suppose voting, equal rights to food, equal rights to healthcare, or things like that. This is the liberty that we opt for. And on this side of a status quo, the motion reads, this House believes that the Jacobin reign of terror did more to protect liberty than to destroy it. We're speaking against it. So, first of all, my speech would be divided into 3 parts, firstly covering the certain sorts of characterization and framing, and later going forward to arguments and rebuttals. First of all, see, Jacobin era was a radical phase of French Revolution. It's just after the post-revolution, a lot of people, first of all, tackling the counter-revolutions, then fighting for themselves, fighting with all their means and with all different forms of narratives they have, all different forms of viewpoints, political ideologies they have. People think differently, and thought process of people differ to person. So ultimately, the revolution, which was led by these peasants, they also have a lot of thought processes, political viewpoints from their own perspectives. And at that era, at that time, Jacobin era's people, like the leaders or the public safety committees having only 12 people, they couldn't represent all the people of that amount of French Revolution. So ultimately, there were a lot of people with a lot of values in them. Now, the point comes in that where did this public safety committee,
Hello.
first of all,
I'm very sorry, but our internet connection went off for a bit. Can you start over?
from the beginning?
No, we could hear your first like 20 seconds, but then we got cut off and we couldn't hear anything else.
Okay, then I'm starting over, I guess. That'd be better.
Just right before, I want to flag that if you've been cut off for more than 5 seconds, somebody should be texting, like anybody from your friends, either any of the Yachcore should be contacted. But if you're comfortable with starting again, Elo, feel free to do so, but this does lag the debate a lot.
Okay, I will go over again. So starting my speech again in 3, 2, and 1. So as I was telling that we dream of a world where there is political liberty to people, where there is political freedom to the people, freedom of speech, and they have certain sort of dignity towards them. And in those sort of a world, a person can think freely, he can express himself freely, he has the rights to, he has equal rights to food, he has equal rights to housing, he has equal rights to healthcare, education, and whatnot, because he is born as a human. This is a world where liberty exists, and this is the world what we see with liberty. And in this type of a status quo, what the motion reads actually, this House believes that the Jacobin reign of terror did more to protect liberty than to destroy it. Now, see, my speech would be divided into 3 parts: characterization, then going into framing and setup, and towards the end, I will be going to my arguments and covering some rebuttals. Now, first of all, as I was saying, how does these Jacobin era look like? See, Jacobin era is just the post-revolution era of the French Revolution. In that time, in France, what did take place? What was the status quo of that was taking place over there? First of all, see, there were a lot of people, lot of different ideologies running here and there. There were a lot of people thinking in various perspectives from one to another. They had all the different sorts of political ideologies you can even imagine of, because that's the time when they got to think to rebuild themselves. They had their own thoughts to rebuild their own nations. And in that sort of a time, there is a committee of public safety which comes in and governs these people. Now, when these public safety government, like this committee governs these people, obviously they were just a 12-person committee. They cannot represent all the ideologies present. May have like represented the maximum, but what we are saying on this regard is like these people have differences in their political ideologies. And next, see, in that type of era, they took power using their own influence, not the support of the people who actually supported French Revolution as a whole. They had a lot of authoritative influence, actually grabbed power at that time. Now, later it comes that at that time, what happened was they were indulged into mass political violence, and they radically imposed their values of republics among the people, which the people, you agree or not, you have to follow now. And these political invasions or these political pressurizations was obviously there. Now, on this kind of thing, it's really hard to define that who were the real enemies of revolution, because you could create a mob, and again you could speak against a certain person or a group of people that okay, they are bad. Suppose it was very easy to radicalize or to victimize these people who worked in with the nobles or who worked under them. They had no incentive to work under them, but ultimately they had to eat for a certain period of time. So either you have any personal issues or any communal issues, it was really easy to tag those people or the other people as enemies of revolution. Here comes our arguments. Firstly, the first argument says these radical these steps will obviously harm the principle of dignity. See, how does the principle of dignity look like? It actually looks like that as a human, the person should receive certain sorts of rights just because he was born as a human, like equal rights to food, to rights to education, rights to suppose healthcare and things whatnot. So and like the political rights and the rights to express themselves pretty freely at that moment of time. Now, what happens when you impose certain sort of things on them, or you tag those people of that killing? See, at that time, that era, the people after the revolution, they were like bloodthirsty, and they were like, I don't trust that person. He might be the enemy of revolution, or that community is harming us. So tagging could be very easily done, and victimizing those people was just very simple that you do. And in this moment, when you don't, victimizing is easier than at that time, you don't support those people and you don't respect that person's dignity. That is, you don't let them carry out their freedom, you don't let them freely speak, because ultimately people are also in terror that they might be tagged, they might be killed, and they might be hung from whatever, for what reasons and everything like that. And then comes like, why is it like justified? See, people tend to fear things which they don't know of, or fear things which the trends are going. So ultimately, you might have worked with somebody, or a peasant might have worked to a large land for money or through pressure or anything like that. He is always in the pressure that I worked with him, he was killed. Now, that peasant doesn't have any sort of connection with that entity, that noble. But ultimately, the people can tag him that, okay, that person is an enemy of revolution. And again, if you have any sorts of different suggestions that you can give to your own government or your own republic, then you are again executed because you are speaking differently. And in the name of purifying the revolution, you are killing these enemies of revolution, actually harms these people and actually gives the autocracy, and it makes them a lot authoritative to kill those people even without trials. So ultimately, it's easier to kill people and then eventually harming the principle of dignity. And the second argument is about people not feeling safe at the end of the day, which was a lot covered in the last argument. See, when you are like tagging people every now and then, that okay, that person might be someone who is the enemy of revolution. So ultimately, when you tag those persons and you can kill them because you don't have proper proceedings of law, you can just create a mob and kill them, and none is going to tell you anything, because the proposition also comes and says that you can execute those people without like because naming it that it was an emergency to kill those people, because if you don't kill those people, then you will be harmed. If you don't kill those people, your revolution can be there. If you don't kill those people, your republic won't be there. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when you deal with such things like naming as emergency, naming as saving the republic, you name to like you want, by telling that you want to save the republic, you are killing people, and then you are justifying it because it's what? Because there were threats for foreign invasion and then counter revolution. So these, you are using actually the revolution to justify killing people for your own autocratic gains. It somewhat means, or to gains. So ultimately, when you can kill the people are in fear, the people are not feeling safe. So ultimately, this harms their liberty to do certain things at a certain state, because you never know what people are going to think about them at those statuses. Like, the people don't have the freedom to think in a certain way. They don't have the liberty to think in or to express in a certain way. And this resulted in eventually this revolution falling into the hands of Napoleon, and there is a 8-year rule of dictatorship to them. So ultimately, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, calling upon DPM whenever you're ready. Hear, hear.
I'll just take like 10 seconds to set up my timer. Am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. At the top of my speech, realize that they try to push this unfair burden of principle, right? We do not claim that killing of these people were principally justified. That is not the burden that the motion asks us to prove, right? Our claim is that we simply believe that it opened the door for liberty in the future for marginal classes of people for decades and centuries to come. We will prove to you about how it was simply impossible to achieve this outcome without the reign of terror, and for that reason, very proud to propose. Before I move on to my extensions, here's a few points of rebuttals. They tell us that realize this, even if you think the support was thin and our measures were harsh, the impact is so much smaller than they claim. Why is that? 4 reasons. Firstly, time-bound emergency, as noticed, that if this was the harshest tool, right, it still lasted about a year, because the Jacobin regime was short-lasting. It was a very short-lasting regime. Once invasion risk fell and internal plots were crushed, the terror ended, right? This is not a permanent blueprint for rule. That means it was very short-termistic. Secondly, emergency courts focused on active counter-revolution. What does this look like? This looks like plotting. This looks like hoarding during famine. This looks like treason. That is different from a blanket of denial of liberty to all citizens, right? Realize that daily life for most people in back then, their work, their family, their worship remained the same for the overwhelming majority. Thirdly, the outcome of this whole reign of terror matters, right? Those short-term limits prevented a much, much larger loss of liberty. Royalist restorations or foreign occupations. If the republic had fallen, peasants likely lose land, feudal payment returns, and speech assembly rights disappear for decades on their side of the world. Realize this, arithmetically, months of emergency limits as opposed to years of preserved gains, right? our POIs on chat. Just give it to just give it to us here. On duration and numbers, we weigh you out on both of those criteria. But secondly, realize this one thing. They had this one claim about how people felt unsafe back then. This is post-revolution France, right? After French Revolution, there was complete chaos, and it's just far more worse on their side when you do not have that reign of terror. People will feel unsafe on either side of the world, but we tell you it happens much less on our side of the world because the reign of terror doesn't reach the common person, right? A common person can just stay fine, whereas on their side of the world, the alternative is a civil war and power struggle. People get caught up within the civil war, and the impacts are just far more. Then thirdly, understand that this is imposition and violence is just far worse on their side, are far worse on their side, right? Without emergency power, these royalist families would just impose a monarchy again, and it just and without the reign of terror, you wouldn't be able to stop these kind of impacts from happening. Secondly, then realize that requisitions and price policing were better put into place because of the law and also the general people being the maximum majority, and also anti-hoarding codes kept Paris and the army fed up, right? So with that being said, moving on to our extensions. Firstly, realize that price ceilings and anti-hoarding enforcements stopped speculations and prices, right? This kept bread affordable for the maximum amount of people and prevented the kind of urban collapse or the hoarding that exists on their side of the world. Secondly, forced loans and requisitions on the wealthy shift wartime burden upward, right? So the poor do not carry all the pain, rather it goes on to the upper class people. What is the outcome of this then? The most vulnerable citizens, which include the peasants, keep eating and have their and can keep their land, right? That is the real liberty that we choose. Understand the freedom from old rents and freedom from hunger is what makes your life is what liberates you, right? What is the weighing here then? Understand the government's measures protected the daily freedom of millions of people. It gave them bread, it gave them land at the cost of some targeted counter-revolutionary individuals. If the republic falls, the poor lose both bread and security and land securities, right? On our side of the world, even in numbers, we save so many more people with the expense of the lives of a few people. Understand then why this protects liberty on our side of the world. Against oppositions, it destroys freedom claim. Understand that in any kind of wars, speech or press is narrowed down for a while, right? But for an average peasant or at that time, the decision was whether you could live another day, whether you could buy bread, right? Those answers changed for the better and stayed changed on our side of the world. The people losing status this meant that we protected the most vulnerable people on our side of the world, right? Understand that the magnitude is far higher on our side because we make sure that we protect the most vulnerable of the vulnerable people. With that being said, another substantive third argument as to how we make freedom and equality irreversible and build institutions that outlast the terror. What's the premise of this? Realize that moderate politics alone had not locked in the revolution's egalitarian changes, right? They were reversible while France was already under siege. What's the mechanism for this then? Firstly, realize that careers open to talents, especially in the military, and there's more military recruits, which in turn breaks aristocratic monopoly that was prevalent in then France, right? Promotion by merit creates newer elites loyal to citizenship, not by birth, and that is not just by birth, and that is only possible on our side of the world when you have liberty. Secondly, realize the civil reforms are on secular life on our side of the world, right? You have a lot of reforms in laws of civil marriage or divorce. You have equal civil status, and that is only possible on our side of the world when you have those reforms. Thirdly, abolitionist and anti-feudal directions under the convention signals that this baseline is equality, right? On our side, you achieve that equality. Even when later regimes may roll back on some parts, the floor stays higher on our side of the world because the republic survived and set that precedence. What's the outcome of this then? After the reign of terror ends, these norms and structure persisted on our side of the world, right? So the net liberty available to the ordinary French people in the 1975s is greater than it was in 1792, if and only if the republic lived through the storm. That only happens on our side of the world when you have that reign of terror. What is the wane here then? Realize the institutions that empower ordinary citizens may last years and decades, and the emergency courts only lasted months, right? The whole reign of terror was a very short-termistic reign. On time horizon, on our side of the on time horizon, we win this because with a limited amount of suffering, we ensure that you have a much better outcomes in the longer run. Much better outcomes in the longer run. We tell you that if opposition pushes that the terror killed civil liberties and it executed thousands, our response is that yes, it did. There were severe short-term right violations. We concede to that, but these were absolutely necessary in a place where you had an emergency and a high coup risk. Where ordinary procedures failed, you need extreme measures to intervene. Without the reign of terror, you would have never achieved the liberty that we have on our side of the world. And for all those reasons, we believe that on their side of the world, you never get that liberty. And for all those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, calling upon DPM whenever you're ready. Just a quick reminder, this is finals. One of the things that make debate really amazing is when you give and take POI. So, DLO, whenever you're ready.
Am I properly audible?
Yes.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Side government's entire case is based on denying history and reality. They tell you that there is going to be a short-term harm for long-term benefits. This is simply untrue. If you just read history books, you will know that after this period, Napoleon came into power, and he was one of the most authoritarian figures of all time. And for the next 80 years, it was called the century of humiliation for France. This is largely because oftentimes when you will have these sorts of power vacuums, it will cause rise to a large amount of authoritarian figures that they never truly engage with. Now I'm going to engage with their first premise, that foreign invasions are oftentimes worse on our side. This is simply untrue for a couple of reasons. I think the first reason is due to inherent power vacuum. As you kill off a large number of top people, oftentimes you cannot properly collectivize militarily. And this is important because, panel, imagine who is the military likely to be filled with. These are likely to be going to be filled with the yes men of these nobles and landlords. So when you kill these individuals, oftentimes there is not a large number of trained soldiers who can actually go out and fight wars for you. And even if they do fight wars, they cannot probably win. But secondarily, if their comparative is, hey, we're going to train a large amount of people, I think training takes a large amount of time. And since they claim that there is an active invasion like in France by Poland, I think this largely means that you don't have time to train soldiers that they're talking about. All of this means that you are actually very, very likely that you are going to lose wars. And this is exactly what happened in history. France lost the war to England in 1794. I genuinely do not understand the comparative. All of the rest of the rebuttals will largely be integrated. Now I'll move on to my first extension on why on just utility this is going to be bad, that they claim is going to be far better. I think firstly that these leaders are just going to be authoritarian figures or like strongman figures. This is because of a couple of reasons. The first reason is for large scale collectivization, you just cannot have a mass number of people just doing whatever they want. This is inherently because this lacks coherence, and you're not going to be able to collectivize properly or make sure everyone gets what they want, which is something they agree on. But secondarily, the leaders oftentimes want to consolidate power themselves. One, because they have political incentives to do so. The more higher you climb in the political ladder, the more financially better off you're going to be. So for meeting their own proximate needs, oftentimes leaders want to care about themselves. Thirdly, to prove that you are worthy of leading the revolution, oftentimes you need to take large amount of actions. This looks like killing your political enemies, or killing even innocent people, or killing people who largely did not do that grave amount of a crime, but just killing them because you have to, and just showing them that you are capable of leading the revolution and capable of being as brutal as you need to be. This is important because this largely means that the leaders of the revolution are likely to be strongman figures. This is important in two regards. One, I think this is directly antithetical to what liberty stands for. Liberty stands for like maximizing political freedom, maximizing things like ability to choose your political political leaders, not killing your political enemies, which largely reduces your choice. But secondarily, the people genuinely lived in fear back then, panel, because they thought that if I even said something bad about the revolutionary leaders, then I was going to be the next one hanged. I was going to be the next one killed. This is extremely synonymous to living in an authoritarian regime. I genuinely do not think this is what liberty stands for. But secondarily, I think this is going to largely lead to authoritarianism. And this is because there is going to be inherently a power vacuum, and it is going to cause civil war. Firstly, because you are going to kill people at the topmost positions, so there's inherently a large amount of positions you need to fill. Secondarily, there are other groups that oftentimes also are incentivized by things like money and power. So they have an inherent incentive to fight against other groups to get that power. But thirdly, oftentimes you kill off the security forces, you kill off the military, because they were filled with the yes men of nobles. So there is no one to stop this civil war. There is no one to fight against this violence. The bottom line of this is that there's going to be a civil war, and huge amounts of innocent people are going to die. This is exactly what happened in France. Now note here, this doesn't just stop at innocent people dying. This gets even worse, because oftentimes after the civil war and after the power vacuum, the leaders who are going to come are going to be extremely authoritarian. And this is because, firstly, when the leader arrives, they do not have an incentive to be democratic at all. Couple of reasons for this. Firstly, oftentimes these leaders are going to control the means of production. So the people can just go against you. They just can't fight against you because you just then stop feeding them or you stop giving them water. Secondarily, oftentimes you have a strongman image, which means if anyone talks back against you, if anyone says anything bad about Napoleon, hey, you get hanged. Thirdly, oftentimes being democratic means that you have the risk of losing. And when there's a risk of losing, oftentimes there might be things like trials, where if you do get trialed for all of the harms you've done to the people, then you might get killed. This is inherently something authoritarian leaders do not want, which is why they are largely incentivized to not be democratic. All this means is that the power vacuum is going to be filled by an authoritarian leader who doesn't care for the vast amount of people, which is exactly what Napoleon stood for. Note, this is directly antithetical to everything they stand for, because authoritarianism means that the person who is in control of power is not someone you voted in. It's not someone the people inherently chose. So sure, you might get things like food or healthcare, but that's only food or healthcare for the yes men of those authoritarian figures, or people who only say who are only siding with them. What this largely means is that, one, this is obviously not going to benefit everyone, so we already deal with their claim on food, healthcare, and everything. But secondarily, we believe this figure is not the morally righteous actor to make this decision. Oftentimes, if I am to buy all of their claims that you need short-term decision making or whatnot, sure, but this short-term actor needs to be a morally righteous actor, an actor that the people democratically choose or that the people even care for. Insofar as I'm able to prove that this is going to be authoritarian, there is no reason this is true. Before I move on, I'll take a PY. 3, 2, 1. No engagement. All right, now I'll move on to my second extension on why this is going to be principally unjustified. And this is something they never engage with. They just tell you, hey, we don't really care about principles. Two things here. I think this violates the principle of human dignity. Note, panel, in the revolution, a large amount of people were killed, they were tortured, and they were slaughtered. And we've also proven to you that this might also include things like innocent people. You inherently cannot do this, panel, because you inherently cannot judge the value of anyone's life. Insofar as we do not know how valuable one person's life is compared to another person's life, there is no inherent way to put that value onto them, which means either everyone is inherently equal in their terms of human dignity and human value, or that everyone has infinite human dignity, and therefore we cannot trade it for something else. Note what they do. They tell you that you're going to get food, housing, or healthcare, or whatnot. This is inherently trading off individuals' human dignity to get some amount of utility. This is something that inherently cannot happen, because you cannot trade in something that has infinite value for something that is utilitarian. Note the analogy for this panel. We would not execute the entirety of humanity just because it would probably better the environment. We believe that is something that is inherently immoral. This is inherently something that they support, because inherently what they're doing is taking away the dignity of these individuals. Note, why do we care about dignity in this debate? I think human dignity is inherently what liberty is. Liberty largely means the ability to choose for yourself, the ability to make decisions, panel. you are only able to make decisions only when you have your human dignity, or when human dignity is maximized to a larger degree. When you take away the human dignity from these people, you take away their liberty panel. But secondarily, we would like to tell you that oftentimes the large amount of people who you are going to execute are people who are forced to live under this regime. For example, the innocent people, or probably like people who just like tilted towards these because their parents would have been killed or their children would have been killed. Insofar as this is largely true, we believe that this is an immoral actor to take this decision, and even if they're moral, there is genuinely no utility on side government. So on all metrics, we win. Extremely proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech. Calling upon GovWhip whenever you're ready. Here.
Hi, I will be starting my speech in a few seconds. Am I clearly audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. At first, I would like to give a few responses to their case. One, about whether or not the military actually becomes weaker and whether or not we lose wars and ultimately end up causing more damages. First of all, this is literally untrue in terms of facts, right? Because look at the timeline. France's worst defeats came before the Jacobins fully centralized their powers, i.e. like in like mid 1973s, etc. Right? So after the emergency measures, when like there was a lot more centralized supply, as well as when there was like a lot more price controls, this ultimately ended up stopping. And as a result of that, you didn't really, the army performance, as well as like merit-based promotions, etc., actually increased the army-based performance. Secondly, we actually think that we ended up having a lot of concrete results, right? Like in around like right after the Jacobin law, the French won major land victories, as well as and that ultimately pushed the coalition armies, and that ultimately ended up resulting in not making the military as weak. Thirdly, we also think that because of a lot of manpower, as well as stable regions and just a very direct and clear command of these people, there was and because of like promotion by merit and not just by where you were born and all that, we think that there were just larger, better fed armies, and this was extremely important, because without a lot of strict price controls that Jacobin era came with, you would never end up having that. So lastly, we also think that Britain at around this time, like there were still other forces like Britain, as well as like and other forces which actively dominated the sea. So a lot of the losses that happened after this war actually did end up happening. But even then, France got stronger. They didn't get weaker because of on a lot of decisive fronts, they were still strong. Secondly, even if you buy their some losses claim, realize that the impact is way smaller than the claim, because we had some short and contained setbacks on our side of the world, maybe, but in a multi-war, but in like full-scale wars like this, a lot of losses happen. So what matters is whether or not the state collapsed. The state did not. The emergency system that kept the armies fed, it kept on existing. More people did not die under this pretense, and most importantly, the net effect that protected this liberty ultimately ended up staying there. So even though you probably had a few tactical losses, i.e. maybe you killed off a few military elites, that wasn't that big of a deal, because they were able to like strategically survive out of these problems, and they were able to simply stop from these army leaders just rebelling and coming out and ultimately worsening this situation. Understand that if anything, on their side of the world, the military is way weaker. And this is because they had zero emergency tools, and as a result of that, and this is because if they didn't have any emergency tools, a lot more people would start rebelling, a lot more people would start having their own ideologies, and that would ultimately fracture the defense. So ultimately, the mechanism on their side would be either you split the military and the military goes in multiple directions, or the military simply fractures further and you have fewer soldiers, and because of less price control, you also are not able to sustain them. So ultimately, on their side of the world, there's just worse leadership, more defeats, and ultimately the liberty dies way, way faster. Realize on a secondary level, realize that whether or not on like a moral dignity standpoint, right? Realize where people's dignity actually helped more. Consider the alternative. On their side of the debate, there's likely to be no dignity at all, because the Jacobins for a while stopped wars from actually happening. So if we really wanted their side to continue, there would be more and more uprisings, more and more people coming in, and more people simply dying. Because realize that the Jacobins, unlike what they want to characterize, they did not target normal people or innocent civilians, because the innocent civilians literally voted and put them in power in the first place, right? The people they actually targeted were people who like, you know, were people who were actually trying to bring up a protest and, like, you know, and bring up internal dissent. The reason we say this is because realize that normal people saying things and normal people being scared of saying things literally doesn't make sense. Back then, social media didn't exist. A one person disagreeing with them did not mean a lot, because the news did not travel that fast back in those days. The only people who were controlled and who were overseen were nobles, and the nobles were the ones who were targeted because they were also the ones who had the necessary amount of political capital to bring up and internalize dissent. Secondly, they also actually strengthened them in certain areas. For example, Napoleon was just stronger at the time, right? As a result, it makes sense that they defeated them. But France would probably be, like, you know, this cooked after a revolution, no matter what. So you're just like choosing the wrong people to blame by blaming the Jacobins. If anything, the Jacobins actually stopped widespread warfare for a long time, and that's why we actually very proudly oppose this. Thirdly, we think that they're under the entire clash about whether or not they were actually bloodthirsty and violent, right? First of all, realize this claim is simply not true, because they did have popular backing. For example, the convention that actually empowered the Jacobin committees was elected, and that's why like the state, and that's why people actually agreed into their term, because of the social contract theory. And more importantly, there was mass participation that actually proved this kind of buy-in. And that actually proved this kind of buy-in. So what this meant was large-scale people actually realized the fact that what this kind of like control meant was simply that people would be able to access a much more decent standard of living and live what a dignified life actually means. There is no dignity if you are dead in a civil war following the revolution. There is no dignity if multiple internal dissents consistently causes you to live in the worst possible circumstances a human being can live in. We think that because these people, first of all, literally voted them in, but secondly, were able to live much better lives without constant revolutions and without constant problem, we were actually able to improve and like just give much better dignity in the long run, and as well as in the short run. Realize that you cannot mobilize. Secondly, realize under the same class that you cannot mobilize and feed the largest armies in Europe for a year without like broad cooperation from workers, peasants, and towns. You need, and when there's like such a huge chaotic environment because of a revolution literally happening, it's very hard to do that without being very, very controlling. This does not mean that it was authoritarian. This does not mean that this was like a full-scale authoritarianism. It just means that there was way more control, because that is exactly what the system at that time required. Lastly, let's compare the entirety of their case to alternative violence, right? Because they never talk about the counterfactual that we pushed onto them. Realize when civil wars and restorations happen, a lot of the times they produce wider and longer terror. What does this look like? On their side of the world, it would have looked like foreign retribution happening. A lot of royalist people just coming in and causing a lot of issues. We think that on an optical level, because of the Jacobin era, the people learned two specific lessons. One, that a people's state can mobilize and defend itself, and secondly, the fact that emergency laws must be temporary. And we also think that because of the fact that it only lasted for a year, and after that they were voted out, this was not necessarily a permanent dictatorship either. Lastly, we think the reason we win is because of two specific things. One, the fact that like there was literal existential stakes over here. If the republic failed at that time, the liberty would have collapsed for every single person, and that would have brought in much more large-scale harms. This terror made the survival much more likely, and that alone outweighed the temporary carbs, the few amount of people that you killed who were probably innocent, but the larger amount of people that you killed who were not innocent, who were actually trying to create internal dissent, were gone from the picture, and that's just better. Secondly, we also also think that millions kept land and were able to have bread for breakfast every single day on our side of the world, right? Thousands suffered emergency justice for a month. And as a result of that, we think that even on a temporary level, we protected liberty much more. Lastly, we also think that this terror immediately locked in merit as well as equality before law, right? And as a result of that, this liberty ultimately shaped the way that this revolution would end up controlling these people, right? And that is why we think that it's so important that you weigh this specific position against everything else. And lastly, we also think that fear is inherently overstated on their side of the world, because fear was time-bound, not permanent. Realize who were punished: the people who were most hurting the wars as well as the effort. Since we believe that we provided proper justice, we are so proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, calling upon Upwhip whenever you're ready. Here.
Hi, am I properly audible?
Yes, you're very properly audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. If the Jacobin Reign of Terror was so good in protecting liberty, so good-fated, it wouldn't lead to 20,000 mass execution when the noble population was 9,000. It wouldn't lead to indecisive killings, and finally, to the longest failure of any republic in European history with the rise of Napoleon. So much for liberty, so much for a republic, only to be followed by an authoritarian rule under Napoleon, with no liberties, no civilian rights, no freedom. One thing to point out: we do not need to prove on our side as to why our alternative was successful or better. Heck, we don't even need to raise an alternative. We just need to prove that the Jacobin Reign of Terror destroyed liberty any more than it protected liberty. It's their burden to prove to you why it protected liberty rather than destroying or distorting it. They actively want to push this false burden of proving our alternative wrong when we do not have the burden to proving an alternative in the very first place to begin with. It's not even relevant to the debate. This frames out half of their case out of this debate. They already lose. Moreover, I'm very unsure if proposition even knows what liberties are or what the French Revolution looked like. I'm going to rebut 3 points. I'm going to give 3 rebuttals, then move on to 3 things. 1, the principle, which is completely unengaged by proposition. Secondarily, liberties. Thirdly, subsequent effects. And I'm going to beat them on their own metrics. 1, duration, and secondly, the amount of people saved. But before that, rebutting their point on the army somehow getting better due to God-given powers. This did not happen. The only war that the French went through during the Jacobin Reign of Terror was the first coalition European war. Guess what happened? They lost. This is factually right, but secondarily, I'm going to prove it to you through structural reasons. 1, there were a lot of radical sudden reforms within the army and the state as a whole that the army could not adjust to. This led to 2, internal factionization and fractions inside the army, for which there was no centralization and they could not have one singular control or leadership, meaning they could never cooperate within war and no wars were won due to this reason. Thirdly, there were mass killings of generals, even those who were not related with the noble. This meant there was no one to actively centralize the army, as there were a lot of mentalities and ideologies within the army which separated them in the battlefield. And this led to a very inefficient methods of war, which never led to any win. Fourthly, they had a lot of untrained troops and no resources at that time due to all the reasons previously given in their speeches why you had no resources at that time and you could not train them. Guess what? They have their own case. The only time the French won at wars was under Napoleon's authoritarian rule. They don't win any wars against the under the Jacobin Reign of Terror to begin with. Second rebuttal. They talk about prices got less in some way. I want to state 3 things over here. Firstly, 1, sure, we accept the fact that prices got lower, but this was due to a very short term. and they never even tie it to liberty in any way as per your choices increase or whatever. This becomes completely irrelevant. But secondarily, sure, the prices were lower for a very short time when the people were united. But guess what happened? Shortly after, there were a lot of sudden reforms, a lot of radical groups, a lot of factionizations, which meant it made it much, much harder to keep prices in check, meaning the prices increased after a very short-termist effect that they talk about. But thirdly, you cannot weigh this out. They say, oh, destroying the entire republic and all on liberty is somehow justified for a 10% drop in bread prices. You cannot outweigh this. The amount of harms caused by the Jacobin Reign of Terror was much, much greater than any benefit that you can derive from a 10% drop in bread prices or whatever. Thirdly, this is an amazingly silly point when they bring out, oh, people somehow had good lives because apparently they voted for this reign of terror. One, no, there were no votes. This was a violent revolution at which at first the people cooperated in, but in later terms it was much more counterproductive than it brought any benefits. But secondarily, they say, oh, people would not feel unsafe because somehow these are God-given people who want good for the people. This is not true. Shant already gives you a host of reasons. We give you a host of reasons as to why these people have incentives to become strong men. These people have incentives to maintain their political power. These people want to have more political capital. These people want to eliminate their political enemies. There is no incentive as to why these people would make people feel safe. But historically speaking, a lot of innocent lives were lost just because they had some views that were opposing to the main action committee or to the main individuals in power, which meant this point of people feeling safe somehow does not work anyhow in their debate. And this is directly linked to liberty. Liberty is people's freedom, it's people individuality, it's people security and safety. These are things that are never guaranteed on their side. These are things that disproportionately harmed on their side. And the main reason behind it, the Jacobin Reign of Terror, meaning their own case does not stand in the very first place. Thirdly, they say, oh, very peacefully, the Jacobin Reign of Terror and the Action Committee was voted out, quote unquote, voted out by the people. This did not happen. They were overtaken by another violent coalition, which also pushed them to the guillotine and also mass executed the Action Committee, meaning liberties were further damaged. Sure, your PI. 3, 2,
Hello, hi,
1.
sorry. How do you make sure peasants have food on the table every day?
We do not need to. We don't have any alternative. We do not need to prove any alternatives. You had the burden of proving why the Jacobin Reign of Terror was something good. We had the burden of proving why it was not, and it destroyed liberty further. We already have fulfilled our burden to begin with. Now then, on to principle. 1, we tell you why it's so unjustified means, and it is completely unjustified and it's illegitimate. They never engage on this. So they, maybe there are some metrics through which this overweighs the principle, but they never state those reasons or weighing mechanisms to begin with. Meaning, this principle still stands, and they have no reasons as to how this is outweighed or overframed on their side. Meaning, on our side, we have principle reasons as to why it brought more harm to liberty or destroyed liberty than it any more protected it. Secondarily, we tell you the principle of dignity is directly related to the principle of choice and principle of proportion, meaning these are things that are directly linked to liberty, which they never do on their side. They throw a lot of facts at you, a lot of random remarks at you, but they never tie it to their burden or to their case to begin with. Secondarily, onto liberty. Their main mechanism under this is, people deserve freedom, and so this was maybe justified, and people somehow had better prices, and somehow, they never say how, better liberty. 1, we have already told you how this denied people freedom even further. They want to debate on 2 metrics. 1, duration and more people saved. Let me tell you. 1, on duration, this never worked. This was a very short-termist 1-year period, of which only a few weeks was successful. The other ones, people felt unsafe, people were killed, people were mass executed, people were hungry. Meaning, on duration, we easily win this. And this subsequently was the basis of the foundation of Napoleon's longest reign of authoritarian rule. Meaning, on their side, liberties were much, much harmed. Secondarily, on more people saved, they harm much more people on a longer basis. Just think that just due to the fact that their harm has a longer time frame, you already harm more people, but a lot more innocent people becoming political enemies were harmed and killed on your side. These things never happened on our side.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, calling upon op reply to finish from opposition.
Am I properly audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Give me 20 seconds. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. We had two pathways to victory, and only one of them was engaged with by side proposition. I'm going to deal with the first pathway to victory, that the utility is actually better. Here, they point out a couple of things. For example, prices get lower, you might be able to put food on the table and whatnot. We give you a bunch of responses here. We tell you that there is going to be a civil war in these countries. So oftentimes, there is not going to be a lot of people working. And even if there are some people working, that is not going to be enough to do things like keeping the economy stable. Or if people are, dying, that's actually really bad on utility. Note what is the best case here. The best case here is that sure, they get food on the table, but note what we tell you. This is only going to be for the people that support the authoritarian ruler like Napoleon. And this is extremely important because note panel, would we really say that the Taliban giving like a lot and putting food on the table for men while killing thousands of women every day in Afghanistan is the definition of liberty? No panel, it is not. Because even if they're able to prove that some people get better because they were subservient to the ruling class, that is just what the noblemen and the landlords stood for. This is exactly what the French Revolution stood against. So what this largely means is that even in their best case scenario where they do provide this utility does not meet the definition of liberty. But note here, they keep pushing this weird burden on why it's better on our side. I genuinely do not get this. This house believes that has done more harm than good. So we genuinely do not have to prove it's better on our side. We just prove it's worse. Now I want to note here, they tell you on military that this is going to be far worse. They give you a couple of reasons here that, hey, there's going to be merit-based positions, you're going to change it, you're going to reform it. Note, even at their best case scenario where all of this is going to happen, I genuinely do not understand why this is going to be successful, because presumably they already flagged that this is going to be very urgent, and if you don't respond properly, then the state is probably going to collapse. Tell me why in 1 or 2 years, when there's a civil war going on within the country, you will be actively able to collectivize when there is no trained soldiers in your country. And even in their best case, where you probably train soldiers for 1 year from scratch because you killed all the noblemen soldiers or all the yes men, you are still going up against soldiers who are trained for 10 or 15 years. So you are more likely to lose wars, which is historically what happened. They can't keep denying history. Then they have this weird tangent. They tell you, hey, you're trading off short-term harm for long-term benefits. Genuinely, what you're trading off is short-term, is like long-term benefits. Because note here, panel, on their side, things actually never get better because we are able to structurally prove to you that things like strongmen leaders are going to come in, or things like authoritarian figures are going to come in, who are going to kill large amounts of people just because they want to maintain power. This is never responded to in any way by any of the speakers in this debate, so this still stands. What this largely means is that we are able to prove that to some degree as well, that utility on our side is far better because people don't die, or the authoritarianism doesn't exist because of liberty. Then on to our second pathway to victory, the principle, which just doesn't get engaged to at all. I think human dignity is something we ought to genuinely care about in this debate. Their only response to the principle is, hey, people are also dying, people would also die if the Jacobin regime didn't exist. I genuinely do not get this, because sure, people might have died, but that is still also principally unjustified. The comparative is, when you get a good because of this principle unjustification, that is not something that we ought to care about, or that is not something that is inherently the definition of liberty, because inherently you are using innocent people, you are killing innocent people to pay for the food in the table of that yes man. What this largely means is that insofar as the way you're getting that food for individuals, or you're getting that healthcare for some individuals, is inherently unjustified, that cannot be the definition of liberty. At the end of the this debate, we are able to beat VDC on their own metric, that we make people's lives better. And we are able to prove that even if we lose on that, we're still able to win on the principal justification of liberty. Give me liberty or give me the win on pre-rolls. Proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech. Calling upon Gov reply to finish the debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, I'll just take 30 seconds for the win. All right, assuming I'm audible, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, you cannot give people liberty or dignity when they're dead. So proud to propose. How I understand that they keep on pushing this burden on us, or how on there's our side of the world we do not ensure dignity dignity at all, right? Understand that they themselves haven't exactly given us any mechanism as to how they ensure this dignity. When you do not have food on your table, when you do not have jobs, when you see your family dying, you do not have dignity. When you see that your country is war-born in a civil war, when you see that your parents are getting killed, you do not have dignity. Understand that at least on our side of the world, the Jacobins gave you hope. The Jacobins did make it better for you, even if it was for a marginal time, right? Understand that they keep on avoiding this burden of how they ensure that these people actually live and have food at their table, right? They keep on telling us, oh, it's not my burden. It is your burden. And unless you tell me about how you actually sustain these people, none of your benefits and dignity stands, right? So what then it is then, right? I understand that these Jacobins actively made sure that things didn't Jacobins actively made sure that things didn't take turns for the worst, right? It actually made sure that this era didn't continue for a long while. Like we told you that the emergency courts didn't last that long. It lasted only a month. But then secondly, realize this, them not engaging with the alternative and how it's going to be on their side of the world is just absurd, because something had to come at that point in time, right? If nothing came to intervene, this would have been far worse. We've given you enough alternatives, and they have not engaged with that whatsoever. Thirdly, realize that do not let opposition skinny this debate into Talibans with their fancy examples, right? I understand that Talibans are against half of the population and absolutely hates women. Jacobins only opposed people who wanted to bring in revolutions to make the chaos even further, right? Jacobins only oppose the people at the higher ups who were making the revolution, who were an obstacle at the path of revolution, right? This matters because it is not half of the population. It's those people who project higher duties on the degree of harm. Then how is then the dignity is protected on their side? They give me no comparative answer. What on top, notice that this was the army and what is the principal response then, right? That the right to in general life is prior to the right to a dignified life, and this is a direct a response to their principle. Realize that liberty is in fact dependent on some degree of utility, right? People chose to live in a state with some restricted rights because of utility, and because of that utility, existing allows them to exercise the liberty in their hands better. Secondly, realize that belief was not erased, right? Private belief continued. Earlier revolutionary laws had already granted equal civil status to both Protestants and Jews. They had civil marriage, divorce reduced in church, and the church's control on personal life decreased, right? De-Christianization pushed by the radicals was not a stable national policy, and it did not last. Thirdly, liberty is in fact dependent on some degree of utility. People chose to live in a state with restricted rights because of utility, and that is what makes your life important. This was made possible by these Jacobins. This is something they lose out on their side of the world entirely. Living a life where on their side of the world, living a life where your basic rights aren't met is not at all what giving dignity looks like. Giving dignity looks like, right? People understand that they have made this absurd claim about how people didn't vote and the Jacobins just got power anyway. People did vote. Do not let them just get away with lying, right? Understand that on our side of the world, we pointed this out from both whip and DPM. They should have responded to them before. My whip weighed this, right? So on our side of the world, we give you a much better analysis as to how we have more liberty on our side of the world, and for all those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that wonderful speech, and I thank both the teams for an amazing debate. You guys can leave the call or you can stay in it. All of the panel, we can move to breakout room 1 for the debate, not 1, sorry, prep room for deliberation.